They paid her to stay silent, but instead of signing the contract, she picked up her homemade stethoscope and live-streamed a Turbine's deadly confession for all of MIT to hear. In the narrow corridor of an old gray building at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, the echo of steel-toed boots carried without hurry, without rush. The one walking was a small young woman with tied-back brown hair, her palms hardened and smelling faintly of machine oil. Her name was Lila, 23 years old, daughter of a welder from the barren outskirts of Nebraska. Lila was not an MIT student. She held no scholarship, no research title. She was only a temporary hire, brought in to fix equipment inside the energy laboratory. A worker in the shadows, passing unnoticed through these monumental halls. Yet for her, every step inside this campus was a heartbeat she could never replace. MIT, the temple where thousands of brilliant minds carved the arcs of the future, needed her only to tighten bolts, replace joints, or wipe off a thin coat of dust. Her father had once told her, "Metal has a soul, Lila. If a weld is wrong, the steel will cry out. If you learn to listen, you'll hear it breathing." She grew up in the clang of hammers, the acrid smell of burnt steel, the glow of the welding torch. Toys were scraps of copper pipes. Her violin was a pair of tin cans strung with wire. Instead of lullabies, she pressed rubber membranes against old pumps to hear how misaligned bearings screamed. So while students around her recited Navier-Stokes equations and Bernoulli's principle in polished slides, Lila did something different. She bent low to the Turbine's housing and listened. Her first day at MIT, Lila was assigned to the Renewable Energy Lab, home to an experimental turbine driven by compressed airflow meant to push the boundaries of wind energy conversion. The turbine was 3 meters long, gleaming steel, sensors fastened in clusters, a giant beast in slumber, waiting to be awakened. To MIT researchers, it was treasure. To the corporate sponsor funding tens of millions, it was sacred. Mistakes could never leave the room. That was the unspoken law. A temp mechanic like Lila was never supposed to question it. But that evening, when the lab emptied out, Lila returned. She took off her gloves, pulled from her worn backpack a crude stethoscope, an old copper pipe fitted with stretched rubber. Crouching, she pressed it against the housing, shut her eyes, and then she heard it, a faint hiss, a thin, broken whisper bleeding through the steel wall. Not the hum of gears, something sharper, trembling, like bubbles collapsing inside a liquid stream, what fluid dynamicists call cavitation. For MIT students, cavitation was a diagram in a textbook. For Lila, it was a scar from nights in her father's shop, when she saw impellers cracked open by invisible bubbles. Cavitation kills machines like cancer kills men, silent, but certain. Her work log required her to note only replaced bolts, cleaned housing. But in her mind, equations unfolded. She grabbed a discarded sheet of paper, drew the swirling loops of low-pressure regions, the imploding microbubbles tearing at turbine blades. Her hand trembled. The sketch mirrored almost perfectly the vibration data the lab had been puzzling over for weeks. Yet Lila knew. Temps don't get to ask questions. She stood up, gaze wandering across the cavernous room. Neon light washed over her tired face. In the sheen of the turbine's steel, she thought she saw her father's outline again. He was gone, claimed by a welding accident years ago. But his voice still burned inside her like molten metal. If the machine is crying out, you cannot abandon it. MIT knew nothing of Lila. Nothing of the rented room so cramped she slept curled on a thin mattress. Nothing of the night shifts at the repair garage that bought her noodles. Nothing of the small hands already branded with burns since age 14. To MIT, she was nobody. A temporary worker. Forgettable. But inside her invisibility, something was stirring, a seed of defiance. When she finally stepped out into the October night, Boston's wind cut through her thin jacket. Bare trees rattled under a sky heavy with slate clouds, like compressed vapor waiting to rupture. She clenched the pipe stethoscope in her hand, whispering to herself as though speaking to him, "I heard it, Dad. I heard it call." In that moment, MIT was no longer just a place of prestige. It was a battlefield, and inside its shining turbine, a small, fragile cry for truth was waiting. This was only the beginning. The next morning, the Renewable Energy Lab buzzed with its usual rhythm. Graduate students crowding around terminals, screens glowing with graphs of vibration spectra, pressure distributions, velocity fields. The turbine had run another overnight test. The log showed irregular spikes, something the team still couldn't explain. Numbers rose and fell like a fevered pulse. Lila entered quietly, toolbox in hand, jacket smelling faintly of metal dust. She wasn't meant to look at the screens. Her task today was simple: tighten a flange, check coolant flow, sweep up filings. Invisible work. But her eyes lingered. On the screen, the peaks of vibration reminded her exactly of what she had sketched the night before. The hiss inside the turbine had already spoken to her once. Now the machine seemed to be crying louder. A graduate student in a neat sweater leaned back from his chair and caught her staring. He smirked. "Don't tell me you're trying to solve our equations, mechanic," he said, stretching the word with casual cruelty. "What's next? YouTube tutorials on fluid dynamics?" The others chuckled, not maliciously, but with that effortless dismissal reserved for outsiders. Lila lowered her gaze, cheeks warm. She could have stayed silent, as always. But her hand, almost without permission, reached into her pocket. She pulled out the crumpled piece of paper, the sketch of vortex loops and collapsing bubbles. I just noticed something," she said softly, placing the paper on the table. The laughter stalled. On the page, her pencil lines mapped pressure differentials curling at the blade edges, cavitation zones forming where the velocity rose and static pressure plunged. She tapped the lowest loop. "Here. That's where vapor bubbles would collapse. If the collapse frequency matches this vibration mode..." She pointed to the screen. "Then, the turbine isn't just noisy, it's tearing itself apart." For a moment, silence. Then the smirking student frowned. "That's just a sketch. You don't know." But another researcher leaned closer, eyes narrowing. "Wait. Look at the Fourier spectrum." He overlaid her hand-drawn loops with the digital trace. The alignment was eerie, almost exact. Peaks of destructive resonance lining up with the collapse cycles of cavitation. The room quieted. Lila stepped back, clutching her toolbox as though preparing to retreat. She hadn't come to fight. She only wanted them to listen. In her chest, her father's words echoed, "Metal cries out in whispers. It takes courage to hear." One of the senior postdocs, brows knit, finally broke the silence. "Where did you learn to draw this?" Lila swallowed. "In my father's workshop. He fixed pumps, cavitation, killed more blades than rust ever did. He taught me to hear it." Her voice trembled but did not break. By now, the data on the screen looked less like numbers and more like a confession. The turbine was speaking through vibration, through bubbles imploding at supersonic speed, and only the girl with grease-stained fingers had stopped long enough to hear it. In that instant, the lab's hierarchy shifted. Not in official titles, not in paychecks, but in silence, in the way every eye was drawn back to her sketch. The hiss she heard alone last night was no longer hers alone. It belonged to the whole room now. The graduate student tried to laugh again, but the sound rang hollow. No one joined. Lila tucked the sketch back into her pocket. She did not smile. She did not gloat. She only returned to her workbench, hands steady, tightening bolts as if nothing had happened. Yet beneath the clang of her wrench, the truth had already taken root. The turbine was wounded, and someone, somewhere up the chain, would not want that wound exposed. The hum of computers filled the renewable energy lab like a nervous heartbeat. The turbine rested silent in its steel casing, but its echoes still lingered in the air, vibrations captured in graphs, peaks, and valleys of unexplained noise. Lila sat on a low stool, repairing a coolant line. Her hands were steady, but her ears caught every murmur around the room. At the far end, a group of graduate students clustered around the projection screen. The data from last night's run scrolled endlessly. Pressure drops, harmonic spikes, the kind of technical riddles MIT thrived on. One student sighed. Another anomaly. The blade resonance keeps drifting. None of our models predict this. Another adjusted his glasses. We've checked the boundary layer, the turbulence models. Nothing matches. And then, almost as if he couldn't resist, the tall student from before glanced at Lila. Maybe our mechanic can solve it for us, he said. His voice carried the easy arrogance of someone who had never been hungry, never been invisible. The room chuckled. Lila did not answer. She wiped her hands on her coverall, rose slowly, and approached the table where yesterday's data lay open. Her heart pounded, but her father's words steadied her. The metal will tell you the truth, if you dare to listen. From her pocket, she unfolded the crumpled sheet, the hand-drawn sketch of cavitation loops shaded with pencil smudges. I think you're hearing cavitation, she said quietly. The student scoffed. Cavitation? That's elementary textbook nonsense. This turbine runs on air, not water. Don't confuse YouTube tutorials with graduate research. Laughter rippled again, lighter this time, but strained. Lila laid her paper flat against the table. Her finger traced the curve she had drawn, the low-pressure trough near the blade's leading edge, where velocity spiked and pressure collapsed. If the air is humid enough, she said softly, tiny vapor pockets form. They collapse when pressure recovers. Each collapse is like a hammer blow, thousands per second. It doesn't matter if it's water or air. The physics doesn't forgive. The room stilled. One postdoc leaned forward, comparing her sketch with the spectrum graph on the monitor. The harmonic spikes, violent bursts in the data, lined up almost exactly with the collapse cycles she had drawn by hand. His brow furrowed. She's right. Look at mode 3. The frequency matches almost perfectly. The tall student opened his mouth, then closed it again. The words of dismissal hung in the air, heavy, brittle. For the first time, no one laughed. Instead, eyes turned to the mechanic who wasn't supposed to speak. The girl with grease on her sleeves had given the turbine a voice. Lila stepped back, folding her sketch again. She didn't smile. She didn't need to. The silence around her said everything. But silence can be dangerous. At that very moment, behind closed doors elsewhere on campus, the project leaders were already growing restless. A turbine worth tens of millions of dollars could not afford whispers of failure. And whispers, once spoken aloud, have a way of echoing through walls. 2 days later, while Lila was bent over the turbine's coolant lines, tightening a stubborn joint with both hands, a voice cut across the lab. Lila Carter? She looked up. A senior administrator stood at the doorway, crisp suit, clipboard tucked under his arm. His eyes barely lingered on her coveralls, as if even acknowledging grease would stain his suit. The project director wants you in the council room, now. Every wrench, every keyboard, Every whisper in the lab seemed to stop. Graduate students looked up from their screens, eyebrows raised. Mechanics weren't summoned to the council floor. Not temps, not her. The council room was on the top floor of the energy building, behind a heavy oak door known half-jokingly as the gate. Few had ever crossed it. Behind that door, careers were decided, budgets sealed, futures drawn in ink. Lila walked the hallway slowly, boots clinking against marble tiles, the crumpled sketch still folded in her pocket. She passed portraits of Nobel laureates staring down from the walls, faces carved with authority. When she reached the door, her hand hovered over the brass handle. She remembered her father's words again, softer this time, almost like a blessing. The steel cries for those who listen, but truth cries louder. With a breath, she pushed the door open. The room was wide, windows stretching to the Charles River, light spilling across a long, polished table. Around it sat professors in gray suits, project managers with binders, and, most striking of all, a man in a dark tailored jacket. Sleek glasses, polished shoes. The corporate emblem gleamed on the folder before him. The CTO of the sponsoring energy conglomerate. Lila felt her pulse quicken. At the head of the table sat Dr. Alden, the project lead, a man known for his stern silence. He gestured for her to sit, though there was no seat set aside. She perched at the edge of a chair, grease stains vivid against the leather. "Miss Carter," Dr. Alden began, voice measured, "it seems you've proposed an explanation for the anomalies plaguing our turbine tests. Cavitation." The word lingered like a stone dropped in water. Lila nodded, throat dry. "Yes, sir." "I heard it through the housing. The resonance matches the vibration data you've been logging." The CTO shifted, leaning forward, his tone sharp. "Impossible. Cavitation belongs in hydraulic pumps, not in advanced air turbines. Do you think you've discovered something that our entire engineering division overlooked?" His question was not curiosity. It was challenge. It was warning. Lila unfolded her sketch, hands steady. She laid it before them, loops of pressure troughs, shaded cavitation zones, arrows marking implosion cycles. Quietly, she said, "The frequency doesn't lie. Each bubble collapse hammers the blade. If the humidity rises even slightly, this turbine is not just inefficient, it is self-destructing." Dr. Alden leaned over, studying the crude pencil lines. His brow furrowed. He glanced at the data analyst, who opened a laptop and overlaid her hand-drawn pattern with the vibration logs. The match was undeniable. A hush fell over the table. But the CTO did not stay silent. He slammed the folder shut. "If what she claims is true, gentlemen, then every prototype we've commissioned, every unit worth tens of millions, is compromised. Are we to halt the project on the word of a mechanic?" The word was spit, sharp as steel shavings. Dr. Alden did not answer immediately. His eyes lingered on Lila, as though weighing something far heavier than her sketch. For the first time, she felt he was truly seeing her. Not just her hands, but her mind. And in that pause, Lila realized something chilling. The truth she had uncovered was not only fragile, it was dangerous. The council room emptied slowly, like a storm that had passed but left the air heavy. Professors gathered their binders, students whispered in corners, and one by one the door closed behind them. Only the CTO remained at the far end of the table, his glasses catching the dull light. Beside him, an assistant slid a thin folder across the polished wood. "Miss Carter," the CTO said smoothly, his earlier sharpness replaced with a chilling calm. "You've demonstrated unusual perception, not something we expect from a temporary mechanic." The word temporary lingered like a leash. He tapped the folder. Inside is an offer, consultant status, a generous stipend, more than enough to take care of yourself and perhaps your family for years. Lila did not touch the folder. Her hand stayed in her lap, calloused fingers curling. The assistant added gently, "It also includes a non-disclosure agreement, a simple precaution. No public comments, no independent reports. The Turbine project is too critical. MIT does not need scandal." The CTO leaned forward. His tone was velvet now. "Understand, Miss Carter. Discovery is valuable, but disruption is costly. If this issue becomes public, the university, the company, even the careers of those in this room will suffer. What we offer you is security, recognition, a seat at the table, all in exchange for discretion." Through the tall windows, the Charles River gleamed under fading autumn light. For a moment, Lila saw her reflection in the glass. Coveralls stained with grease, face drawn from sleepless nights. A young woman who had no place among these suits. The folder on the table looked like a lifeline. A promise that she would never again count spare coins for rent. Never again eat noodles in silence after double shifts. Her father would have called it hush money. If the machine cries out, you cannot abandon it. His voice rose in her mind, steady as a hammer blow. The CTO's smile widened, mistaking her silence for hesitation. "You're clever enough to know what's best. Sign this and you'll never have to crawl under machines again. You'll be one of us." He slid a pen toward her. The weight of the room pressed down. The brass lamp glowed against the folder's edges, making the contract look almost holy. Lila stared at the pen, at her hands scarred with burns, at the machine's ghostly hiss still echoing in her ears. Money could buy quiet, but money could not buy truth. Without a word, she stood. The chair scraped softly against marble. The CTO's smile faltered. "Think carefully, Miss Carter. Some doors open only once." Lila looked at him, eyes steady though her chest trembled. "I already heard the turbine," she said. "And once you hear it, you can't pretend it's silent." She turned, walking toward the door, the folder still unopened on the table. Behind her, the CTO's voice hardened into steel. "Then you've made a dangerous choice." The door closed with a heavy click. Outside, the hallway was cold, but Lila's breath came clearer than it had in days. She had not signed. She had not betrayed the voice of the machine. Yet deep inside, she knew. The battle had only begun. The workshop smelled of oil and rust, a perfume that clung to Lila's childhood like a second skin. The walls were lined with tool racks, shadows stretching across concrete, and in the corner, a single desk lamp threw a soft yellow halo. It was nearly midnight. MIT's corridors were silent, but here, the echo of her father's old shop seemed alive again. Lila sat at the workbench, sleeves rolled, her hands wrapped around a small recorder she had hidden during the turbine test. She pressed play. From the tiny speaker came a faint hiss, ragged, uneven, like breath through broken lungs. The turbine's confession. She closed her eyes. In her mind, she was 10 years old again, kneeling on the dusty floor of her father's garage, ear pressed to a rusted water pump. "Hear it, Lila," her father had whispered. "That's cavitation. Those tiny bubbles will eat the steel alive if we ignore them. Machines cry out before they break. We listen, or we lose them." He had been her first teacher, his textbooks written not in ink but in scars on metal. And now, though he was gone, his voice seemed to vibrate through the recorder's hiss. "If the machine cries, you don't walk away." On the bench before her lay the contract folder. She had taken it, not signed, but carried it out of the council room as proof. The paper inside glared at her under the lamplight, numbers too large to comprehend, promises that could end her hunger, her endless nights. She touched the corner of the folder, then withdrew her hand. The turbine's hiss played again, brittle and sharp. She reached instead for her makeshift stethoscope, the copper tube, the rubber membrane, her father's legacy as much as his voice. She pressed it to the side of an old motor in the shop, listening. The familiar hum comforted her, steady, alive. Machines told the truth. People, less so. The words of the CTO replayed in her mind. Some doors open only once. But what was a door worth if it led into silence? She leaned back, eyes on the ceiling beams, her body heavy with fatigue. For years she had worked quietly, content to be invisible, content to fix what others broke. But now the turbine's voice had made her a witness. And witnesses, once they hear the truth, carry a burden. From the recorder, the hiss surged, peaked, then fell quiet. Lila whispered to the emptiness, to her father, to the steel around her. I won't abandon it. Not for money, not for comfort, not for fear. Her words dissolved into the hum of the motor. She sat alone until dawn, cradling the recorder, listening again and again to the turbine's cry, each repetition sharpening her resolve, each hiss a call to act. By morning, she knew. The machine had spoken, and the world would hear it. The turbine bay was dark, save for the low glow of safety lights along the floor. Midnight again, when the campus slept and the machines stood still. Lila wheeled in a small cart, her backpack sagging with scavenged gear, a set of cheap piezo sensors, duct tape, a second-hand webcam, and her battered laptop. Tools no one in a research lab would ever take seriously. Tools that were hers. She had rehearsed the plan in silence for days. Now, as she knelt by the housing, she moved with the focus of ritual. One by one, she taped sensors to the steel shell, their thin wires trailing like veins. She plugged them into a simple amplifier, then into her laptop's input. A crude chain of listening devices, the digital echo of her copper stethoscope. On the desk nearby, her phone screen glowed. She opened a stream, not private, not hidden, but public. The caption read, Live test. Listen with me. At first, the counter showed 0 viewers, then 1, then 3. Students burning the midnight oil, idly clicking. A group chat pinged, spreading the link. Numbers crept upward. Her heart pounded, but her hands stayed steady. Lila whispered to the machine as she primed the airflow system. All right. One more time. Tell them what you told me. The turbine roared to life, air shrieking through the intake. The steel housing vibrated under her palm, a beast waking restless from sleep. On her laptop, the graph began to dance, waveforms jagged and sharp. She increased the airflow, watching the peaks climb, and then it came. The hiss, the familiar, terrible hiss, bursting through the sensors into the graph, red spikes stabbing upward. She adjusted the webcam, focusing it on the graph. Do you see? She said softly, voice shaking. That's cavitation. It's eating the blades alive. The live chat exploded with comments. What is this? Wait, that's the vibration log? She's showing real data? More viewers joined, tens, then hundreds. The word spread across dorms, study lounges, midnight coffee shops. MIT students leaned over laptops, watching a young mechanic in coveralls point to a trembling red graph. Lila leaned closer to the housing, pressing her copper tube to the steel. The hiss grew louder, almost screaming now. She held her phone near it so the audience could hear. "This is what your textbooks can't show you," she said. "The turbine is confessing. Listen." Through headphones and speakers across campus, hundreds of students heard it. The ragged cry of collapsing bubbles, the whisper of steel under attack. For the first time, the machine's voice was not locked inside a workshop. It was public, alive, unstoppable. The view count passed 1,000. Someone in the chat typed, "We're recording this. Don't stop." Lila nodded to herself, tears stinging her eyes, though she didn't know why. Maybe it was relief. Maybe it was fear. She looked at the graph, at the red peaks that aligned with her father's warnings, and whispered, almost to him, "They're hearing it now, Dad. They can't pretend it's silent anymore." The turbine screamed as airflow surged through its veins. Steel shuddered. Cables trembled against the walls. In the flicker of her laptop screen, Lila watched the vibration graph surge upward, red lines jagged like lightning. Chat messages raced faster than her eyes could follow. "This can't be real. Look at the resonance. Mode 3 is exploding. She's showing us the death of a machine." The viewer count climbed. 1,000, 1,500, 2,000. Word spread through dormitories, cafeterias, study halls. Students left their problem sets unfinished. Professors leaned over their phones. MIT was awake, all watching a lone mechanic. Lila adjusted her setup with trembling hands. From her backpack, she pulled a second device, an old high-speed camera she had borrowed from the mechanical workshop, meant for tracking tiny fractures. She positioned it against a transparent inspection port in the turbine housing. The feed came alive, blurred at first, then crisp, showing the edge of the turbine blade. And there it was. Tiny bubbles flickering in and out of existence, collapsing like miniature stars, imploding in darkness. Each collapse struck the steel with invisible violence, the same rhythm that spiked across her graph. Gasps flooded the chat. "Holy God, that's cavitation." "In an air turbine? Impossible." "No, undeniable. Look at the collapse waves." Some students began screen recording. Others mirrored the stream to larger projectors in dorm lounges. Dozens gathered around glowing walls, the hiss of the turbine echoing into rooms that had never smelled of oil or steel. For the first time, theory had a face. Not a diagram in a textbook, not an equation in chalk, but a living, breaking machine. Lila raised her voice above the roar. "You see it now. Cavitation doesn't forgive. Every second this runs, the blade erodes. This turbine is not the future. It's a wound growing deeper." The chat blazed. "Show them the data logs! Don't stop recording!" She toggled the laptop screen to show the raw sensor data streaming live. Numbers scrolled faster than her breath, frequencies harmonizing with the hiss that filled the air. It was a confession in real time. And then the chat shifted. "Faculty are watching. The dean is in here." Screenshots are all over Twitter. Lila froze for a moment. She hadn't planned for this. She wanted students to see, but now the circle was widening far beyond her control. The turbine's voice was out in the world, amplified through hundreds of recordings. There would be no erasing it. She placed a hand against the steel shell, feeling its desperate tremor, and whispered into the live stream, "This is not my secret anymore. It belongs to all of you." The turbine roared one final time, the hiss sharp and clear, like a cry that cut across campus and into memory. For a long moment, no one in the stream typed anything. The chat stood still, as if holding its breath. And then messages flooded again. Fear, awe, defiance. The truth had been broadcast. By dawn, the entire campus was humming, not with turbines, but with whispers. The live stream had spread like fire through paper. Clips of the vibration graph and collapsing bubbles flashed across group chats, forums, even news feeds outside MIT. Professors arrived to morning lectures only to find their students already gathered in huddles, watching recordings of Lila's midnight broadcast. The turbine's hiss was no longer hidden inside steel. It was everywhere, echoing through earbuds and laptops, a voice that refused to be silenced. At noon, the announcement came, an emergency council session, open to faculty and students. Never before had such a meeting been public, yet the weight of thousands of eyes left the administration no choice. The auditorium filled like a courtroom, professors in suits, graduate students clutching notebooks, undergraduates with phones raised high. On the stage, a long table. At its center sat Dr. Alden, face drawn tight. At his right, the CTO of the sponsoring company, his polished smile strained. And near the end of the table, unexpected, almost out of place, sat Lila. Her coveralls had been scrubbed clean, but oil stains still marked the fabric, stubborn as scars. The murmurs quieted as Dr. Alden rose. Last night, a broadcast originating from this institution revealed serious anomalies in our turbine project, he said, voice heavy. We are here not to bury truth, but to examine it. The CTO leaned forward, microphone in hand. What we saw, he said smoothly, was an unauthorized experiment, conducted by an unqualified temp. It is reckless, misleading, and could jeopardize years of progress. A ripple of unease swept the room. The word reckless rang like a gavel. But then, from the audience, a student raised his laptop high. Sir, we recorded everything. The data matched the logs your own lab has been hiding. Another student called out, We synced her vibration spikes with the internal system logs. Perfect overlap. Screens lit across the auditorium, graphs and overlays shared in real time. The air thickened with undeniable evidence. The CTO's jaw tightened. Data can be misinterpreted. Not by hundreds of us at once, a professor interrupted sharply. We all saw the collapse waves. She revealed what your team ignored. The hall grew restless. For the first time, power tilted away from the suits at the table and toward the sea of students and faculty filling the room. Dr. Alden turned toward Lila. Miss Carter, would you explain, in your own words, what we all heard last night? The microphone was slid down the table. Her hands shook as she took it. She looked out over the crowd, faces, young and old, skeptical and awed. Her father's words steadied her breath. If the machine cries, you cannot walk away. She spoke slowly, clearly. The turbine is suffering cavitation. You saw it. You heard it. Every second it runs at high load. Vapor bubbles collapse against the blades, hammering them to pieces. This is not speculation. It is physics. It is truth. The auditorium fell into silence so deep it seemed to hold its breath. Then, applause. Hesitant at first, then rising, then thundering. Hundreds of hands clapping, stamping, lifting the truth higher than any contract could bury. The CTO sat motionless, his face frozen in its polished mask. But the sound swallowed him whole. The truth had left the council chamber, carried on the voices of students, and no executive power could force it back inside. The project was suspended before the meeting ended. The turbine would not run again until it was rebuilt, until its cry was silenced, not by contracts, but by design. The suspension order went out within hours. Engineers sealed the turbine bay, professors scheduled redesign meetings, and the campus buzzed with a strange mix of embarrassment and awe. But for Lila, the days that followed were quiet. She returned to her workshop, tightening bolts, sweeping floors, pretending life could return to its ordinary rhythm. Yet the ordinary had already left her behind. One morning she was summoned again, this time not to the Oak Council door, but to the president's office itself. The room was vast, sunlight flooding through tall windows, books lining the walls. The president of MIT, a woman with kind eyes and silver hair, stood as Lila entered. "Miss Carter," she said warmly, "you reminded us of something we had forgotten. Truth doesn't always come from titles. Sometimes it comes from those willing to listen." On the desk lay a new contract, different from the one the CTO had slid across the table. No gag orders, no silence. Just an invitation. Technical advisor, renewable energy lab. A role not for prestige, but for voice. Lila's eyes blurred as she read. She thought of her father, of the hiss through copper pipe, of nights eating noodles in silence. And now, here was a seat at the table, earned not by bloodline or diploma, but by listening to a machine no one else would hear. She signed, her hand steady. The president added gently, "We are also adopting a new policy. Any technician, staff, or student may report technical failures directly to the council without fear of suppression. You've given us more than a discovery, Miss Carter. You've given us accountability." Weeks later, the redesigned turbine stood ready. Blades reforged, housing reshaped, sensors recalibrated with her advice. The lab gathered for the test run. Students, professors, even skeptics filled the room. Lila stood near the console, copper stethoscope still looped around her neck, a relic of both past and promise. The turbine started. Air flowed. The graph stabilized. And for the first time, silence. Smooth, steady silence. No hiss, no cry. Only the soft, even hum of a machine finally at peace. Applause erupted. Students cheered, some wiping tears they didn't expect. Dr. Alden, once stern and distant, shook her hand firmly, his voice low. "You taught us all how to listen." Lila smiled faintly, but her gaze drifted beyond the walls to the memory of a small workshop in Nebraska. She imagined her father standing at the doorway, wiping his hands on a rag, nodding once in quiet pride. That evening, she returned to the workshop where it had all begun. She turned on the old motor, pressed her copper tube against its side, and listened. The sound was steady, calm, almost like breathing. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to smile fully, because the machine was no longer crying. And neither was she. Thank you for walking with Lila through this journey. You've listened, not just to a turbine's cry, but to the quiet courage of a young mechanic who refused to be silenced. If this story touched you, I invite you to stay with us. There are more tales of hidden genius, of resilience, of truth whispered in unlikely places. Subscribe, share this with a friend who still believes in listening, and join me next time by the fire, where another story waits to heal.